And now let's decertify this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.
And we've criticized the AMA before, but they've actually done a good thing recently in opposing a national 3-day limit on opioid prescriptions, which is done, of course, out of concern for an epidemic that, as we've covered repeatedly, just isn't happening. Republican Senator Rob Portman of Ohio introduced the bill with his spokesman saying, quote, "People are dying around the country every single day because patients are being prescribed too many opioid pills at one time." That has nothing to do with it, Portman. In fact, as we covered, overdoses are going up as prescriptions are going down. It's happening because pain patients can't get the prescriptions, and in desperation, they turn to the black market where they have no idea what they're getting, how potent it is, or what it's cut with.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's pretty obvious. I mean, you get a completely regulated market with a relatively high demand. Well, you get bootlegs.
And insert Archer meme here. Do you want more overdoses? Because that's how you get more overdoses.
I mean, just every time that they've ever tried prohibition, why are they still trying prohibition? It doesn't work.
Quote, "A 3-day limit is common sense based on CDC guidelines, and Senator Portman is going to stand up and fight for what is right. The problem is, it isn't the CDC guidelines, and also appeal to common sense is a fallacy, but the CDC guidelines actually say, quote, when opioids are used for acute pain, clinicians should prescribe the lowest effective dose of immediate release opioids and should prescribe no greater quantity than needed for the expected duration of pain severe enough to require opioids. 3 days or less will often be sufficient. More than 7 days will rarely be needed." And CDC guidelines also say, quote, "Clinical decision-making should be based on a relationship between the clinician and patient and an understanding of the patient's clinical situation, functioning, and life context. The recommendations in the guideline are voluntary rather than prescriptive standards. Clinicians should consider the circumstances and unique needs of each patient when providing care." In other words, not by a politician who has no medical training and hasn't examined any of these patients.
Right, exactly. And that's just a good way to tell when you should avoid something, whether it's a political position or just an argument, is if it's commonly used on that side of the argument of appealing to common sense. You see that all over the place with climate change regulation or raising the minimum wage or gun control. You hear that all the time. It's common sense. Well, if it's common sense, you should be able to explain it in a way that most people would understand.
Yeah, if it were common sense, you shouldn't have to say that it's common sense. You could just explain why it makes sense.
Right. It's pretty self-evident what you're doing. All you're doing is skipping explaining your position and just telling people what they should think about it.
And also, Republicans want to get the government out of healthcare unless doctors are prescribing medicine they don't like, in which case, get the government into healthcare.
Yeah, no, they don't. They just want to cut spending on it slightly. They don't want to get rid of public health care. You could see that with what Trump's doing. Republicans love universal health care, and it's pretty obvious as to why they love it. It's because it gives them something to run against, and by cutting spending to it, they can pretend that they're doing something about it.
Yeah, they can be the loyal opposition.
Yeah. It's pretty obvious. I don't know why there aren't more people who see that.
And unfortunately, politicians and even healthcare providers have been misinterpreting these CDC guidelines as a call for strict limits and also applying it to chronic pain as well as acute. Such a limitation would leave many chronic pain sufferers bedridden and even suicidal, as we've covered before. In fact, 2 states, Florida and Kentucky, have already imposed 3-day limits. Florida will allow 7-day prescriptions, quote, if medically necessary, based on provider professional judgment. Now, think about what that means. That means that in Florida, if you're a doctor, you cannot write prescriptions for more than 7 days, even if it is medically necessary based on provider professional judgment.
Yeah, aren't there plenty of people who go under surgeries who ask for medication after 7 days?
Oh, yeah. I mean, some surgeries, you can be in pain for months afterward. It just depends on how bad it is, whether or not there are any complications or whatever.
Yay, so you're putting people in agonizing pain for weeks on end. No wonder so many people turn to the black market.
Yeah, I mean, pain's a great motivator, And besides, what does a prescription mean other than an expression of medical necessity based on provider professional judgment? I mean, isn't that the whole point of prescriptions to begin with? That's why government passed all these laws about them.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, it's more so the government can control what people get what and the manufacturers of the medication.
So thankfully, the AMA came out against this, saying, quote, "A strict 3-day limit ignores the admonition from the CDC guideline that clinical decision-making should be based on a relationship between clinician and patient, an understanding of the patient's clinical situation, functioning, and life context, misstates the actual recommendation of the CDC, and applies limits to clinical situations to which they were not intended to be applied. Most patients with opioid use disorder have trouble accessing care as payers and others put up obstacles."
I think that's the most awful part about regulation just of any kind. That's creating the problem. And all the government's doing is just pointing at the market and saying, look, it's because of this unregulated aspect of society. We need more regulation.
And that brings us to this week's moron, Jackie Kucinich of the Daily Beast. She says that the reason this limit hasn't been made mandatory is that Congress is too scared of the AMA.
What? Oh, man.
Yeah, I guess to her, the AMA is like the NRA is to gun control people. The only reason we have guns in this country is because the NRA has spent zillions of dollars to buy off politicians. Sounds like the same thing to me.
Yeah, I mean, forget the long history of political funding against drug use and against the freedom of trading.
Her article begins, "As the opioid epidemic ravages the country..." No, it doesn't. We've debunked this so many times, it's embarrassing. And I mean, not only does she blindly and uncritically accept the insane claims of these politicians, she acts like anyone not calling for more regulation of healthcare is just in the pocket of the AMA and is calling for nothing less than the destruction of all society. But no, it's this insane war on drugs that's causing all the destruction, because politicians get their little panties in a wad over the thought of a few people getting high. We have barriers in the way of legal means of using drugs, not only to get high, but for other reasons as well, such as pain relief. Hospitals make patients suffer because they limit their morphine way below what's necessary to avoid health risks. Doctors refuse to help patients manage their pain for fear of having their license pulled. People who have no criminal background whatsoever are subjected to regular drug testing. If anything, pain sufferers are way under-medicated, and politicians are trying to make it worse.
Yeah, that's just cruel.
So all of that makes Jackie Kucinich this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.